The life I knew fell apart the day I received that first letter. A simple white envelope turned my search for freedom into a battle I could never have imagined. I traded concrete skyscrapers for acres of green, dreaming of a quiet new start on a farm just outside the city. But what I found was a web of rules, constant watching, and power held by people who turned the idea of community into an open-air prison. The name of that prison? HOA, the Homeowners Association. And its leader, Eleanor Wright, embodied everything I'd left behind in the city: control, authoritarianism, and an unending need for uniformity. My story is about how a piece of land became the battleground between individual freedom and collective control, and how that struggle changed not just my life, but an entire community. I always dreamed of having my own space, far from the stifling rules of the city. Years of living in a tiny apartment in the urban chaos made me realize that I needed a radical change. The constant noise from traffic, endless condo meetings, and the lack of connection with nature were slowly wearing me down. I grew up in a family that valued independence. My parents, even though they lived in the city, always encouraged me to question social norms and to find my own way. Maybe that's why the idea of owning a farm took root so deeply in me. I wanted to grow my own food, wake up with the sunrise, and have the freedom to change my property without needing dozens of approvals. In the city, every decision seemed to go through a committee. Wanted to paint your door? You needed permission. Wanted a pet? There were restrictions. Dreamed of having a garden? The rules even limited the types of plants allowed. The bureaucracy was suffocating, and I increasingly felt I was living the life planned out by someone else. When I first saw the ad for the farm, it seemed too perfect. 15 acres of fertile land, a house in need of renovations, which meant I could shape it to my liking, and the price was within my budget thanks to years of saving. What I didn't know was that this property, which represented my chance at freedom, was about to teach me a lesson about power and resistance that would change my life forever. The buying process for the farm turned out to be surprisingly simple. After a quick negotiation, I signed the papers and received the keys to what would be my new home. The realtor mentioned something about a local homeowners association, but downplayed its importance, saying it was just a group that organized community events. How naive I was not to dig deeper. In the first few weeks, I dove into renovation projects. I started by painting the house a shade of blue I'd always admired, installed solar panels on the roof, and began building a small greenhouse to grow vegetables all year round. The feeling of finally having the freedom to create and build was indescribable. Then the letters started coming. The first one seemed harmless, a polite notice from the HOA about the need to get prior approval for any external modifications. I ignored it, thinking my property was out of their jurisdiction. But the second letter had a firmer tone. It pointed out specific violations. The color of my house wasn't in the approved palette, the solar panels were visually disruptive, and the greenhouse did not follow the established architectural standards. Eleanor Wright signed all the correspondences with impeccable, authoritative handwriting. Each letter came with a deadline for making changes and a veiled threat of fines. At first, I tried to communicate, explaining that my farm was private and that the modifications were sustainable and essential for my self-sufficiency. The response arrived in the form of a formal summons. Apparently, when I bought the property, I automatically became a member of the HOA, an important detail that was conveniently omitted during the sale. The document listed a series of infractions and demanded immediate corrections under the threat of daily fines. I realized I was faced with a choice: either submit to the arbitrary rules I had fled from in the city, or fight for the right to live my way. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had left the suffocating control of the city only to encounter an even more intrusive version in the countryside. This time, however, I was determined not to give in easily. The following weeks turned into a progressive nightmare. Eleanor Wright escalated her campaign against my property, turning a simple dispute into an all-out war. The HOA began sending inspectors every week, who photographed every detail of my farm, from the height of the grass to the arrangement of my garden tools. Fines piled up to absurd amounts. I received charges for excess non-standard vegetation in my orchard, unauthorized structures, referring to my raised garden beds, and even for having chickens, which apparently were incompatible with the community's aesthetic standards. The financial pressure was only the beginning. Neighbors who once greeted me started to avoid eye contact. Some, clearly influenced by Eleanor, began making unfounded complaints about non-existent odors from compost and imaginary noises from my animals. The feeling of isolation grew every day, but so did my resolve not to give up. One particularly tense afternoon, I found security guards hired by the HOA patrolling near my fence, taking pictures and making notes. When I confronted them, they claimed they were only documenting visible public violations. The invasion of privacy was blatant, but they acted as if they had every right to be there. That was when I realized I needed professional help. After extensive research, I found Rachel Davidson, a lawyer specializing in disputes with HOAs. In our first meeting, she reviewed all the documents and confirmed my suspicions. Many of the HOA's demands were legally questionable, especially given the size and rural nature of my property. Rachel explained that cases like mine were becoming more common, HOAs expanding their power beyond reasonable limits, especially in areas transitioning from urban to rural. She agreed to represent me, but warned that Eleanor Wright was known for her persistence and that the fight would be tough. Even so, for the first time in weeks, I felt I had a real chance to stand up to that oppressive system. Tension reached its peak one Sunday morning. I was feeding my chickens when 3 police cars arrived with their sirens on. The officers stepped out with their hands on their weapons, shouting orders for me to keep my hands visible. Apparently, someone had reported suspicious activity on my property, suggesting I was growing illegal substances in my greenhouse. Eleanor Wright was standing near the gate, a barely concealed smile on her face while the police searched my property. Fortunately, Rachel Davidson, who had given me her emergency number, arrived within 15 minutes. Her immediate presence completely changed the situation's dynamics. She demanded to see the search warrant and questioned the legal basis of the complaint. After a thorough and embarrassing search, the officers found nothing but my organic tomatoes and medicinal herbs. The false complaint was obvious, but the damage had already been done. Neighbors gathered to watch the spectacle, some even filming on their phones. Rachel, keeping the calm I had lost, documented everything meticulously. When the officers finally left, Rachel confronted Eleanor in front of everyone. In a firm, professional tone, she warned of the legal consequences of false reports and of using the police to persecute someone. For the first time, I saw Eleanor's smile falter. But the decisive moment came when one of the oldest neighbors, Mr. Thompson, stepped forward. With a voice trembling with indignation, he began to recount how Eleanor had transformed the community over the years. Others joined in, sharing stories of intimidation, arbitrary fines, and constant harassment. It was as if a dam had burst. Years of fear and frustration released all at once. Rachel quickly recognized the opportunity. In the following days, she collected testimonials from dozens of residents, documenting a clear pattern of abuse of power and harassment. We discovered that Eleanor had changed regulations without a proper vote from the members, used HOA funds to hire private security without approval, and maintained a system of fines that bordered on extortion. The case took on unexpected proportions when the local media began to investigate. A newspaper discovered that Eleanor had suspicious ties with certain gardening and construction companies that, by coincidence, were the only ones approved by the HOA for community services. The favoritism scheme was exposed. The extraordinary HOA meeting that followed was historic. With more than 200 residents present, Eleanor faced a process of removal from her position. Michael Jenkins, a respected homeowner who had quietly opposed the abusive practices, was elected as the new president. His first action was to launch a complete review of the regulations, with active community participation. Eleanor's fall wasn't just a personal victory, it marked a fundamental change in how the community saw itself. From a group controlled by fear and arbitrary rules, we began to become a true neighborhood where diverse lifestyles were not only tolerated but celebrated. The transformation of our community didn't happen overnight, but every little change brought a new perspective on freedom. Unlike Eleanor, Michael Jenkins set up a diverse advisory board that included residents from different walks of life and experiences. I was invited to join, representing farm owners and those interested in sustainable practices. My property, once seen as a threat to the aesthetic standard, became a model of sustainability. I organized monthly workshops on organic farming, composting, and solar energy. The same neighbors who had once avoided me began coming over with their children to learn about growing food and caring for animals. The kids, especially, were fascinated by the chickens and the vertical garden I set up on the side of the house. Rachel Davidson continued advising us as we reworked the regulations. We created guidelines that preserved property values without stifling residents' individuality. The rules came to focus on safety and the general well-being, not on arbitrary aesthetic control. Solar panels, gardens, and even small farm animals were permitted, as long as they were maintained responsibly. A few months later, Eleanor Wright moved away, selling her house to a young family who transformed the formal garden into a vibrant urban orchard. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The place that used to be a symbol of rigidity and uniformity was now bursting with life and diversity. The case had repercussions beyond our community. Other HOAs in the region began reviewing their practices, fearing similar lawsuits. Rachel was invited to speak about property rights and the legal limits of homeowners associations. Our story became a case study in how to turn oppressive power structures into systems of participatory governance. The most significant change, however, was in the spirit of the community. The HOA meetings, once feared and avoided, turned into productive gatherings where ideas were freely shared. We created an annual harvest festival where residents exchanged homegrown products and shared knowledge about gardening and sustainability. The dream that brought me here, living in harmony with nature while keeping my independence, not only came true, but it grew in ways I never could have imagined. My little farm became part of something bigger, a community that learned real strength isn't in control, but in collaboration. Today, when I see new residents arriving, I no longer see the fear in their eyes that I once felt. Instead, they are greeted with welcome baskets filled with local products and a community manual that celebrates the diversity of our homes. The uniform white fences that Eleanor had prized were replaced by unique, vibrant gardens, each one telling its own story. The battle that started with a simple violation letter turned into a quiet revolution, proving that sometimes it's necessary to confront the system, not just to protect our own freedom, but to pave the way for others to do the same. 5 years have passed since those turbulent days. My farm has flourished beyond my initial expectations, becoming a center of learning and inspiration for the entire region. What began as a personal dream of self-sufficiency evolved into a community project that goes beyond the boundaries of our neighborhood. The greenhouse that Eleanor despised now hosts an educational program in partnership with local schools. Every week, groups of students visit to learn about sustainable agriculture, natural cycles, and the importance of biodiversity. Seeing the sparkle in the children's eyes when they pick their first tomato or discover a worm in the compost makes me realize we are growing much more than just food. We are planting seeds of change in future generations. Michael Jenkins retired as HOA president last year, but his legacy remains. The collaborative governance system we established continues to evolve. We set up a community fund to support sustainable initiatives, from installing rainwater harvesting systems to creating pollinator gardens. The money that was once spent on fines and lawsuits now finances projects that benefit everyone. Rachel Davidson still visits us occasionally, now not as our lawyer but as a friend and mentor. She has helped other communities set up similar models and often cites our story as an example of how peaceful, organized resistance can trigger systemic change. I learned recently that Eleanor Wright moved to a gated community in another state. Ironically, her previous attempts to maintain strict control over our community ended up producing exactly the opposite of what she feared. Instead of decreasing property values, our homes have increased in value, not because of strict rules, but because of the unique quality of life our community offers. Mr. Thompson, one of the first to speak out against Eleanor, now runs our local producers market. On Saturdays, the community space that was once used only for tense HOA meetings transforms into a lively meeting spot where residents exchange not only goods, but also stories and knowledge. My own journey has evolved too. What started as a search for independence taught me the value of interdependence. I learned that true freedom doesn't mean isolation, but the ability to build meaningful connections while staying true to oneself. Last year, I published a book about our experience, From Resistance to Renewal, How a Community Found Its Voice. The stories I shared inspired other people to question oppressive systems and seek more humane and sustainable alternatives. When I walk around my property today, I see more than just a rural farm that managed to hold on to its identity. I see a living testament that change is possible. The trees I planted in those early days, now strong and fruitful, remind me that deep transformations take time and constant care. Every branch extending beyond my fence represents the connections we built, proving that sometimes you have to break the rules to create something truly extraordinary. Our community has become a beacon of hope, showing that there is another way, a way that honors both individuality and the common good. And that, more than any legal victory or structural change, is the true legacy of our story. The epilogue of this story is still being written every day. Just last week, we received an unexpected visit, Eleanor Wright. She showed up unannounced, visibly aged and different from the authoritarian figure we once knew. Her presence initially caused apprehension, but what followed surprised everyone. Eleanor asked if she could speak at our monthly community meeting. With a humility that none of us could have imagined years ago, she shared her journey of reflection. She explained how, after leaving our community, she faced her own transformation process. The gated community she moved to was even more restrictive than the rules she had imposed here, and for the first time, she found herself on the receiving end of oppressive regulations. "You were right," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I confused control with care, uniformity with harmony. Seeing what you all have built here, I realized that my fear of change kept us from creating something truly special." The silence that followed her words was then broken by Mr. Thompson, who stood up and did something extraordinary. He invited Eleanor for a tour of the community. Over the next few hours, we showed her how the seeds of change, accidentally planted by her, had blossomed into something beyond anyone's expectations. She saw children playing freely in the community gardens that had replaced the artificially perfect lawns. She watched neighbors share their knowledge in the sustainable learning center we established in the old HOA administrative building. She met new families who had chosen to live here specifically because of our innovative approach to community life. On my farm, Eleanor stood silently, contemplating the greenhouse that she had once fought against. The shelves filled with seedlings, prepared for the environmental education program, told a story of renewal and hope. "This," she finally said, "is much more beautiful than any standardized white fence. Our story has attracted national attention. A documentary filmmaker is producing a film about the transformation of our community, focusing not only on the physical changes but also on the healing process and reconnection we experienced." Interviews with residents reveal a common theme, that conflict, when approached with courage and compassion, can spark deep and lasting change. The model we developed is now being studied by urban planners and sociologists. We discovered that our experience touches on fundamental questions about how people choose to live together, how communities can balance individuality and togetherness, and how governance systems can evolve to truly serve the people. Eleanor's visit brought a closure we didn't know we needed. Her presence reminded us that change is possible for everyone, that there aren't permanent villains in our story, only people caught in systems that need to change. Today, as I watch the sunset from my farmhouse porch, I see much more than a rural property that managed to keep its identity. I see a web of relationships, stories, and shared dreams that continue to evolve. The fence that once marked the boundary of my property now feels more like a gateway, connecting different ways of looking at and living in the world. Our journey proved that sometimes you have to break the rules to create something better. That resistance can be an act of love for the community, and that true change begins when you dare to imagine a different way of living together. The conclusion of this narrative isn't really an ending, but an invitation for a new beginning. Our community has become a living laboratory of possibilities, showing that there are viable alternatives to traditional residential models. The book I wrote sparked an unexpected movement. Groups of residents from different parts of the country started reaching out to us, seeking guidance on how to transform their own communities. In response, we created a mentoring program where we shared not only the strategies that worked for us, but also the lessons we learned from our mistakes. Rachel Davidson expanded her legal practice to include a department specializing in HOA reform, helping other communities navigate the legal and social transitions we experienced. She often says that our story shows how the law can be a tool for transformation when used with wisdom and purpose. Surprisingly, Eleanor Wright even became an ally in this process. Her unique perspective, having been on both sides, offers valuable insights into how to deal with resistance to change. She occasionally participates in our workshops, sharing her personal journey of transformation as a testament to the power of conscious evolution. My farm continues to be a symbol of resistance, transformed into renewal. Every season brings new discoveries, challenges, and opportunities to learn. The orchard I planted in the early days now provides fruit not only for our community, but also for a school feeding program we established. The deepest lesson I learned through this journey is that real change rarely follows a straight line. It is organic, often unpredictable, and always depends on the courage of individuals who refuse to accept the status quo as unchangeable. Our story isn't just about a battle against restrictive regulations. It's a testimony to the power of community, to the importance of perseverance, and to the possibility of creating systems that nurture both individuality and the common good. It serves as a reminder that even in the most challenging circumstances, there is always the potential to turn conflict into collaboration, fear into hope, and control into genuine connection.